This is Bill Nell speaking. Allow me to begin by explaining a bit about myself and my work. I was a child in the early 1960s when I began to hear volunteer firemen in my local firehouse in East Meadow on Long Island in the New York area talk about seeing strange objects in the sky. Some told of similar stories they had heard from police officers and EMTs. These were credible people considered to be trained observers. Now, to me, all this seemed to go against what the U.S. government was claiming about UFO witnesses being untrained observers, seeing things that were quite ordinary in the sky that they just could not identify. In fact, during the 1960s blackout, which occurred in New York City, I was further impressed by accounts of UFO sightings reported by New York City policemen, firemen, and even celebrities. Actors Warren Beatty and Stuart Whitman both claimed to have seen strange disc-shaped objects glowing in the skies over the city during the time of the blackout. After several years of speaking to reliable UFO witnesses and reading a number of books on the subject, I started a UFO club in high school. This was supposed to be an after-school project for extra credit based on a subject of personal interest, much like a chess or math or even a science club. And I guess I expected that a couple of students besides myself might show up, but I was really astonished when over 150 people tried to crowd into a classroom meant for 50. Each person came with their own UFO story or encounter to share. I was even more shocked when one of the people who showed up actually turned out to be the school principal. Now, this guy was a tough ex-Marine, and he told us about seeing a strange object in the skies over Vietnam during 1967 when he was there. After trying to report it to his commanding officer, he was told not to bother. They already knew what it was, but never went into any more explanation. After high school, 2 years of military service in the Marine Corps, 2 years of college, and continued part-time investigation into paranormal events, I turned my attention to the full-time investigation of UFOs and the paranormal, funded by speaking engagements that I did at libraries, universities, and private events. I still continue to do these. I have personally investigated thousands of paranormal events in 48 U.S. states and most of Canada. To date, I've presented over 1,500 seminars on the paranormal. During the late 1980s, I hosted a cable TV show about the paranormal, sponsored by Time Life Books. I've also produced a number of popular videos about the paranormal, and I was consultant to the popular UFO video documentary, UFOs: The Hidden Truth. You might have read about me in Omni, The New Yorker, Fate, and thousands of other publications throughout the world, and I've appeared on CNN, Headline News, NBC Nightly News, Hard Copy, A Current Affair, and hundreds of other spots that I did on television programs as well as radio shows. I've written a number of articles about the paranormal, and I've been a consultant to the films Independence Day, Men in Black, and Fire in the Sky. But in reality, not much of that really matters. What does matter is that I'm a guy who really loves true stories about the paranormal and enjoys sharing them with others. So let's get started. In July of 1952, a number of UFOs were seen over military installations around Washington, D.C. and the Capitol building itself. Despite the fact that these unknowns were described as solid objects under intelligent control by radar operators who tracked them and military pilots who chased them, an official government spokesperson later said that what everybody saw and photographed was merely a phenomenon known as swamp gas. Despite the fact that swamp gas almost exclusively occurs further south in states like Georgia and Florida during mild October weather, the explanation for these objects seen in July over Washington, D.C. was accepted for the most part by the news media and the public. But not everyone was satisfied. This event capped several others that occurred over a 10-year period, and in each case the government was able to explain away what might otherwise have been considered extraterrestrial encounters. The big question is, why? Why would the government cover up information about UFOs? Most people wonder why the United States government would keep UFOs and the existence of aliens a secret. Well, there are many possible answers to that question, but I suspect that the main reason for keeping this secret is a military one. You'll find out why as we move through this presentation. For now, let's jump back about 10 years to 1942. World War II was the first war in history that was probably fought as much in the air as it was on the ground. Thousands of Allied and enemy aircraft filled the skies. When they did, pilots on both sides began to report strange phenomena that seemed to defy explanation. The first reports came from American pilots serving in Europe and the South Pacific. They described seeing what appeared to be orange and white globes of light and disc-shaped objects that appeared near their aircraft. These things moved at incredible speeds and always acted as if they were under intelligent control. While the origin of the term is unclear, the American pilots called them Foo Fighters. It was either because they believed them to be somehow connected to the Japanese, or it might have been a play on the French word for fire. The term was usually spelled F-O-O, while the French word would have been correctly spelled F-E-U. The same phenomenon was seen on both sides of the conflict during World War II. This photograph shows an object following a Japanese aircraft. The Japanese thought that these were secret American observation devices. The Americans thought them to be secret devices used by the Japanese and possibly built by the Germans. The Germans were certain that these were spy craft built by the Americans or British. It was only after the war that all the parties involved realized that there was going to be no easy explanation for the Foo Fighters. My father served on the staff of General MacArthur during World War II. My father was a United States Army Air Force officer. MacArthur was the supreme commander of all Allied forces in the South Pacific. After receiving word about thousands of incidents of pilots reporting Foo Fighters, he ordered a study of the sightings and those who were reporting them. In the end, the report was over 10,000 pages long, was completed in 1946 after the war had ended, and still remains classified today. My father told me that the gist of the study concluded that all of the objects were probably not any flown by the enemy, and that most of the pilot witnesses were credible. All this may have led to a statement by MacArthur made in the 1950s, in which he said that the next full-scale war would not be an international conflict, but an intergalactic one. Military and civilian pilots remain the most credible UFO witnesses because being able to identify what's in the air around them can often mean the difference between life and death. One of the most controversial cases, and one which has still caused a wide split between government authorities and civilian pilots today, occurred in 1996. On August 9th, a Swissair Boeing 747 jetliner took off from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, bound for Logan Airport in Boston, Massachusetts. This was the first leg of its transatlantic flight to Zurich. While flying at 23,000 feet in a northeasterly direction, about 10 miles south of New York City's Staten Island, the Swissair 747 was suddenly bypassed by a UFO. According to the French press agency, a white object passed within 150 feet of the Boeing 747. Flying at high speed in the opposite direction and to the southeast, the object was clearly visible to the crew. The pilot said it was elongated, white, and without wings, although the co-pilot described it as rather round. Swissair spokesman Erwin Schaefer said, "Neither the pilot nor the co-pilot spoke of a missile." On Friday, September 26, Pat Caricio of the National Transportation Safety Board declared that the UFO was probably a weather balloon. Later the same day, the Federal Aviation Administration said the eerie object was merely a weather balloon. The FAA used statements from other pilots to confirm their belief that the object was a weather balloon. The problem is, the other pilots, a United Airlines crew, were not in any position to actually observe how or in which direction the object was moving. The case remains a sticking point to this day. Most pilots that decide to report a UFO sighting are routinely given some unpaid time off, sent to the FAA headquarters building for a few days, and shuffled from office to office, where interviewers drive home the point that UFO sightings can always be explained as either natural phenomenon or other aircraft.
Boston, good afternoon, Swissair 127 Heavy, final 230.
Swissair 127 Heavy, Boston, sir, good afternoon. Just verify you have the Norwich 2 arrival to Boston.
Refund.
Roger.
Center is Swissair 127.
Swissair 127, go ahead.
Yes, sir. I don't know what it was, but it just overflew like a couple of hundred feet above us. It was like I don't know if it was a rocket or whatever, but incredibly fast, opposite direction.
In the opposite direction?
Yes, sir. And the time was, 2107. It was too fast to be an airplane.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir, 986 Boston Center. The center maintain flight level 180.
Down to 180, yes, sir. 986.
Yes, sir, 986. You see anything like a missile in your area, perhaps off to your right?
Take a good look, but I don't think, if it's going that fast, I probably won't get a chance. We just saw Swissair go by a little bit ago.
Okay, thanks.
One of the greatest misconceptions about UFO sightings is that they always occur in rural areas. On February 25, 1942, this object appeared over Los Angeles, California. Thinking it was an enemy bomber or observation aircraft, searchlights were trained on the object, and Army aircraft scrambled to attack and bring it down. But according to various witnesses on the ground, the plane seemed unable to get close to the object. Instead, they flew away and ground batteries began their attack. Despite shooting over 10,000 rounds of ammo at the unknown, they were unable to shoot it down. A close look at the photo reveals the ammo, or flak, exploding all around the object. Despite the ferocious attack, the unknown just sat there, never shot back, until a point in which it simply vanished. The extent of the attack was apparent the next day, when civilians discovered huge amounts of debris from the exploded ammo that had drifted to Earth throughout the Los Angeles area. Newspapers carried front-page accounts about it. Meanwhile, the Army admitted the alarm was real and that something had been in the skies over Los Angeles, but they weren't sure what it was. In an effort to keep the inability to successfully attack the object and shoot it down a secret, they refused to admit that attack aircraft were ever sent up to try to bring it down. Although it may not be a daily occurrence, UFOs are seen and sometimes filmed over large cities. On August 6, 1997, a UFO seen by multiple witnesses over Mexico City was caught on tape by one of the witnesses who used a Sony digital camera. It's ironic that many dispute the validity of this video. Even when UFOs are seen by thousands of people and caught on tape by independent photographers, we've been so programmed by government authorities and skeptical scientists to believe aliens would just not visit the Earth that many of us just can't believe it when one does. One of the things that really shocked the Allied forces during World War II was the technology possessed by the Germans. The V-2 rocket, basically a 1940s version of most any modern intercontinental ballistic missile, was at least 30 years ahead of what every other government had available. German aircraft were the first to use swept-wing technology, despite the fact that we're told such aircraft cannot fly in a stable manner without computers, which did not exist in a form that could be placed aboard aircraft in the 1940s. According to the U.S. Army's official history of World War II, some German planes even used television and radar-guided weapons. The Germans were the first to fly jets and the only ones to use them during World War II. Some were made of exotic composite materials, carefully held in place by special radar-absorbing glue. America's B-2 stealth bomber bears a striking resemblance to some of the German jets of World War II and is assembled in much the same way. But those jets were assembled and flown in the 1940s. The question is, how did Germany, which had been forced to disarm after World War I, develop so much technology in such a short period of time? The answer is, they may have had help. German plans for saucer-shaped craft found and examined after World War II by the Allied intelligence services suggest that the Germans may have had access to one or more crashed UFOs which had gone down somewhere in Germany at a much earlier date. The circular craft, which Germany never had time to actually produce that we know of, would have been powered by a sophisticated gravity drive using powerful magnetic fields. Was Germany able to glean enough technology from crashed UFOs to jump ahead of the rest of the world in electronics, engineering, and weaponry? Considering the fact that the United States spent the next 30 years after World War II ended relearning and copying what Germany already knew in terms of technology, the answer might just be yes. President Harry S. Truman was a skeptical man, often described as being as stubborn as a Missouri mule. No less skeptical was Frank Edwards, a popular and powerful syndicated news reporter. The two were casual friends, but both would forever become connected to the subject of UFOs because of events that occurred in the year 1947. It was in 1947 that Truman signed the National Security Act while aboard his presidential aircraft, the Sacred Cow. That act ultimately established the CIA, Department of Defense, United States Air Force, and the National Security Council. Some believe that Truman also created a special study group of scientists, military leaders, and civilians known as MJ or Majestic 12. These 12 people were supposed to study the subject of UFOs based on evidence not shown to the public and make recommendations to the president and military on how to deal with the phenomenon. While the National Security Act and MJ12 gave the government new tools needed to secretly handle what they considered to be the UFO problem, they also quietly removed the right of the public to know about them. For a reporter like Frank Edwards, the right of the public to know everything was paramount. Perhaps that's why that in 1947, after these events and other UFO sightings and crashes which occurred, when he saw the secrecy that surrounded all this, Frank Edwards moved the direction of his reporting from mainline news to covering the world of the paranormal. Regarding MJ12, a lot of people wonder if the Mj12 documents which have surfaced since that time are real. I'll answer that question in this way. As far as the UFO research community is concerned, I would say that the vast majority of researchers consider at least one or all of the documents to be fakes. These opinions were reached after a careful examination of the documents signed by President Truman. The results showed that his signature was a copy of the same signature from another totally unrelated document. But at the same time, many of the people mentioned in these documents have unusual connections to UFOs. For example, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, once the alleged head of MJ12, wrote an autobiography that was never published. For some unknown reason, I discovered that it had been locked up in the archives of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Once on that trail, I further discovered that during the latter part of World War II, and before the creation of the Central Identification Laboratory by the U.S. government in Hawaii in 1947, several anthropologists at the Museum of Natural History had been involved in the identification of human remains for the military. While they were working at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in a makeshift morgue, these scientists and anthropologists developed the process of rebuilding human faces around skulls using clay. This made it far simpler to identify remains using photos in a day long before DNA testing had been invented. Now, while snooping around and interviewing older employees that worked at the museum, I also discovered a popular rumor that these same anthropologists had been involved in the reconstruction of dead alien bodies after one or more UFO crashes in the late 1940s and early 1950s. But the thing that really tied it all together was the name of one of the museum's former directors. It was Morris K. Jessup Sr. Morris K. Jessup Jr. wrote a book in the 1950s called The Case for the UFOs, which claimed to expose, among other things, the secrets of UFO technology. Mj12 was and still is a designation for hardware connected to black projects at the Pentagon and found in various non-classified technical manuals. Some of that hardware is designed by a Long Island, New York Technology Institute started by, guess who, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter. If the documents are fake, they were probably placed out in the UFO community to draw attention away from the real MJ12 in order to discredit its existence. If you want an idea of the level of government information about UFOs, just imagine one guy sitting around a computer all day working on fake ideas, stories, and evidence. Now multiply that person by 10,000 others, and you're pretty much there. On June 24, 1947, a former military pilot and highly respected community leader named Kenneth Arnold was flying from Chehalis to Yakima, Washington State, when he noticed 9 objects moving at a terrific speed near Mount Rainier, moving at over 1,200 miles an hour in a motion that he described as stones skipping across the water. The objects were different from any others he had ever seen before. Arnold's sighting capped off a number of other UFO reports from various parts of the country, but his credibility as a former military pilot, air search and rescue volunteer, and community leader made the news media and the public start to consider the possibility that these strange objects were more than just the result of overactive imaginations. When asked to describe the objects, Arnold said that they flipped and flashed in front of his eyes and were saucer or disc-shaped objects. The news media picked up on his description, and the term flying saucer was born. When the U.S. Air Force started to investigate these reports, they decided that a more serious and military-sounding term was needed, so they called them UFOs, or unidentified flying objects.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
With the nation already worked up to a fever pitch about the flying saucer topic by the Arnold sighting and others now being reported around the world, it was less than 2 weeks later when the Air Force stunned the nation by reporting that a flying saucer had crash-landed on a ranch near Roswell, New Mexico. The press release went on to say that the object had been recovered, taken to the Roswell Army Air Force Base, and moved on to other locations for further study. Meanwhile, witnesses like the Wilmot family came forward. They were sitting on their front porch at 105 South Pennsylvania at about 10 o'clock at night when a large glowing object zoomed out of the sky from the southeast, going in the northwesterly direction at a high rate of speed. They went into their yard for a better look and watched the thing for about 40 to 50 seconds, reporting it to be about 1,500 feet above them and moving at around 400 to 500 miles per hour. The object crashed on the Brazel Ranch on July 4, 1947. Mac Brazel reported the situation to Sheriff Wilcox a few days later after driving into town and showing a few pieces of strange material from the crash to friends and family. Sheriff Wilcox contacted the Roswell Army Air Force Base. According to a press release they put out that was dated July 8, 1947, Major Jesse Marcel was dispatched to the scene to investigate. He was the base intelligence officer, but also a physicist. Marcel found material that he described as being like the foil from a cigarette wrapper. When he tried to misshape it, it returned to the original shape. Likewise, it could not be burned and seemed impervious to further destruction. Despite witness accounts of a fast-moving object, the strange material, an assessment by Marcel that it was not of this world, and the military's own admission that it was disc-shaped, a new press release was offered on July 9, 1947 by the Roswell base, which stated that the object was not a flying disc at all, but merely a weather balloon. In what seemed like an attempt to keep the national press as far away from Roswell as possible, a press conference was held in Fort Worth, Texas, by General Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Forces. The idea was to have Major Marcel and General Ramey display a balloon as the explanation for the wreckage found on the Brazel Ranch. The problem was a number of people in Roswell, and possibly a few journalists who had made it into the area, had already seen what some of the smaller pieces of the real wreckage looked like. To make sure that everyone went along with the government explanation, actual pieces of the saucer wreckage was mixed in with spurious material from the balloon. This allowed for plausible denial, as townspeople from Roswell recognized enough of the real material to allow the balloon theory to be accepted. An interesting side note to all this is that for years, most other researchers laughed at the idea of the real material being mixed in with spurious balloon wreckage, despite the fact that what my research showed indicated that that was the case. But recently, a new photographic technique allowed for close examination of the material and indicated that some strange symbols were seen on some of it. Symbols that wouldn't be found on any military balloon. The real wreckage in the photo is a lighter colored, smooth-looking material lying on top of the balloon wreckage near the bottom of the photo. Among the witnesses who have come forward to dispute the official story are former base information officer Walter Haupt and funeral worker Glenn Dennis. Acting on orders from the base commander, Haupt distributed the first press release. He knew Major Marcel very well and felt that Jesse had been made a scapegoat. As far as Haupt was concerned, if Marcel, who was a physicist, not just another government hack like Ramey, said it was an alien spacecraft, then that's what it was. Glenn Dennis was working at a funeral home in Roswell that had a contract with the base as far as providing funeral and burial services when he got a call from the Roswell base. They wanted to know if he had a certain number of child-sized coffins on hand. He had a few, but not the amount requested, and said that he would bring what he had to the base. Once there, Dennis saw that everyone was upset and running around. He entered the base hospital where his girlfriend worked but she told him to leave immediately. On his way out, he was stopped by military police who asked if he had seen anything. He said no, but they told him if he revealed anything about what he saw or heard at the base that night, they would find his body in the desert the next day. It was not exactly a veiled threat. Philip Corso had been an Army intelligence officer on General MacArthur's staff in Korea, a member of President Eisenhower's National Security Council, and head of foreign technology and Army research when he retired in 1963. But in 1947, he was ordered to Roswell to find out what happened by his superior officer at the Pentagon. He says that 5 bodies were recovered from the Roswell wreckage that he saw, which were about 4.5 feet in length, had grayish-brown skin, 4-fingered hands, and oversized, hairless heads. He also says that the technology recovered from the crash allowed the United States government to jump ahead in terms of fiber optics, night vision, materials used for stealth and body armor purposes, as well as many highly classified projects. Despite all the credible witnesses who've come forward over the years to speak out about what really happened at Roswell, the Air Force has never been quite ready to throw in the towel on the subject and admit anything. In fact, every few years they come up with a new explanation for what really happened back then. Recently, in 1997, the Air Force sought to explain the Roswell crash again, this time by saying that the exotic materials found there were related to a secret high-altitude balloon experiment known as Project Mogul. The problem was that Mogul was never active in that area until a few years later. The Air Force then added insult to injury by saying that the bodies found were actually dummies from high-altitude tests, but the dummies were not used until well into the 1950s. When asked about these discrepancies, the government responded that the collective memory of the Roswell event was off track as far as time was concerned. But to believe that, one would have to ignore all the news articles, radio recordings, and other evidences from 1947 that associate the UFO crash with that date. I guess the government policy is, when you don't agree with the facts, change them, ignore them, or rewrite them. The paper trail for UFOs in the government is long and complicated. This document, dated 1950, is a briefing for J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. It's said to have been produced in response to his request for information about crashed UFOs. It states that an Air Force investigator says that 3 flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. Each one was occupied by 3 bodies of small creatures, not more than 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth clothes that the author of the letter compared to high-altitude flight suits. This briefing document leaves little doubt that the government has indeed recovered UFOs in its possession. One of the places mentioned in some of the original reports about the Roswell crash is Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, a huge facility and home to the fabulous Air Force Museum. This base undoubtedly has seen many secrets come and go over the years. Long rumored to be the home of Hangar 18, a place where UFOs have been stored or examined, Wright-Patterson became the center point for official UFO inquiries when Project Blue Book was located there. Blue Book was the government's official inquiry into the UFO phenomenon and lasted from 1947 until 1969. But when the project was completed, files were found dating back as far as 1940. Only a half-hearted effort, the entire project had a budget of under $100,000 and worked through most of its tenure with a staff of under 10. Blue Book replaced 2 previous investigations, Projects Sign and Grudge. Mishandling of files and lackluster investigation procedures were just a few of the legitimate criticisms leveled at Blue Book. A scientific panel that examined the files concluded that 95% of all UFO sightings were explainable, 5% were not, and that UFOs were no immediate threat to national security. Despite official window dressings like Blue Book, deeper questions remained about what the government really knew or didn't about UFOs. When a U.S. Senator named Barry Goldwater from Arizona attempted to gain entrance to a special room at Wright-Patterson said to contain the real information collected and maintained by the Air Force about UFOs, he was denied permission to do so. This is fascinating considering that Goldwater was also a Reserve Air Force general. The person who denied him entry was also a good friend of Goldwater's named General LeMay. He told Goldwater, "Damn it, Barry, you can't go in there and I can't go in there. Don't ever ask me again." This event occurred in the 1960s. In March of 1975, Goldwater wrote a letter to a friend stating that it really happened. The letter has since been released to the public. Jackie Gleason will always be remembered as one of America's greatest comedy talents. Born in Brooklyn, New York City, I guess you could say that he was a graduate of the School of Hard Knocks. Maybe that's why he always seemed to work harder than everyone else around him. When it came time for him to get a show on TV, he wanted to own it. Unheard of in the days of early television, Gleason often penned deals that provided him with huge sums of money and allowed him to produce many of his own shows. Everything Gleason did, he did with great passion. Every script for the TV shows had to be just the way he envisioned it. No one was ever allowed to step out of character. Camera shots and angles were always set up the way he wanted them. His passion also extended into his personal life. Fascinated by flying saucers and the unexplained, he ultimately assembled one of the world's greatest parapsychological libraries. The bulk of it resides today at the University of Miami Library. In 1982, I was a guest on a talk show at a Miami radio station. The subject was UFOs and the paranormal. After the show, I was handed a note by the receptionist. This often happens when I do radio guest spots because some people prefer to share their own UFO or paranormal experiences with me off the air. While walking to my car, I took a quick look at the note. It said, "Please call Mr. Gleason at," and it gave a phone number. When I arrived back at my hotel room, I called the number, asked for Mr. Gleason, and gave my name. An assistant got on the phone and informed me that Jackie Gleason wanted to speak to me, if possible, the next day at a Fort Lauderdale location. Well, needless to say, I accepted the invitation. The meeting location was a bar at the Jolly Roger Hotel in Fort Lauderdale. Now, I don't know if Gleason owned the hotel, or merely had friends there, but after stopping by the front desk, I was escorted to a small bar that was closed to the public at that time of day. Gleason sat at a table like a king holding court, but looked older and weaker than I had imagined he would. I wondered why Gleason hadn't met me in one of his favorite Miami haunts, but it may be that he just wanted to keep a low profile. Either way, I knew that Gleason was a serious guy who hated small talk, and I wasn't about to ruffle his feathers. After a brief handshake, Gleason asked me a number of questions about my UFO and paranormal investigations. We talked for about an hour and a half. Actually, he asked questions and I answered them. He said to me, "You know, I get your newsletter," he said knowingly. "Good stuff." He was especially interested in articles that covered the topic of crashed UFOs. At that time, a lot of buzz had been created by former military officers who had begun to speak out about their involvement with the cover-up of UFO crashes. Out of the blue, Gleason told me how that Richard Nixon was a good friend of his. In fact, he had supported Nixon in every possible way during his successful bid for the presidency in 1968. In 1971, Gleason's efforts were rewarded when he attended a small White House dinner in Gleason's honor. After dinner, Gleason spoke privately with Richard Nixon. He asked the president if there was anything that Nixon could tell him about UFOs. Were they real? Were they alien spacecraft? Well, according to Gleason, Nixon told him, "Well, Jackie, if you can arrange to arrive at MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa sometime over the next few days, I'll arrange to have you shown some things that may help answer some of your questions." Gleason arrived in Tampa, Florida a day and a half later. After calling a phone number provided to him by someone on Nixon's staff, he headed out to MacDill Air Force Base. After arriving on the base, he was taken to a dark-colored building that appeared to be some sort of a storage facility. Once inside, he had to pass through several levels of security. Finally, Gleason was escorted into a large room where some strange debris lay on the floor. An officer told him, "This material is from Roswell." No emotion, just a matter-of-fact statement. The officer handed Gleason a small piece which seemed almost weightless and very flexible. Just then, a light came on in the center part of the room. Gleason was astonished to see what looked like a large piece of a broken disc just floating a few feet above the floor. Warned not to approach it, Gleason still got an eyeful, but the surprises weren't over. After just a few minutes, Gleason was escorted to another room. 3 containers with glass plates for viewing greeted him. These were the occupants found near the object you just saw. Again, with little emotion, the officer gave Jackie a 1-sentence description that spoke volumes. The beings were about 4 to 5 feet tall. 2 of the bodies were badly damaged, but one was in very good shape. As Gleason looked at it, the officer said, "This one died later." It had large oval eyes, grayish skin, and looked male. "Are they all males?" Gleason asked. "Your guess is as good as ours," he answered Jackie with a slight smile, but it was time to go. The experience of seeing the object and bodies affected Gleason more than he first realized. Although he had a hit variety show on CBS, Jackie Gleason walked away from everything for a few years to study more about UFOs and the paranormal. It wasn't until 1975 that he went back to work with the Smokey and the Bandit movies and some other projects. Despite all the denials and downplaying of UFO reports, some of the most compelling evidence that UFOs are here and hail from somewhere else comes from encounters involving the military itself. One such encounter involves the USS FDR. Crewman Chester Grzinski describes what happened. In the year 1958, we were on a shakedown cruise when there was a small light that was following our ship. Then the light came right up to us. It came in close enough to us so that you could see the shape of the object and also see that there were figures inside of it. The impression that I got was that those figures were not human beings. I was down below when I was told to go up topside to see something strange. So I went up and couldn't believe my eyes. I saw a bright white ball of light. It headed straight for us, and getting bigger and bigger. It was spherical, about 75 to 100 feet long. It turned red-orange, and I could feel the heat on my face. I could see silhouettes of figures looking at us. They had no features, and you could tell they weren't human. Then the bottom turned cherry red, and it vanished in a flash. Soon after the incident, crew members who talked about it were transferred. Then the CIA came on board to investigate a so-called gambling problem. It was a massive cover-up, notes Grzinski. There was no gambling. CBS was making a special documentary about the UFO phenomenon in 1973. veteran news anchor Walter Cronkite was approached with the idea. Though the program was to be hosted by several CBS News reporters, Cronkite would do the interviews. By 1973, I'd already been investigating UFOs for several years. As it happened, Walter Cronkite read a small piece that I wrote for a now-defunct UFO publication about the Air Force cover-up of UFO information. Cronkite was making a list of people he wanted to interview for the CBS special, and the article interested him. In September of 1973, I received a letter from CBS News indicating their interest in my work. After a few phone calls, I was actually able to meet and speak with the man himself. On a cool New York City day in late September, I sat down and had an informal lunch with Walter Cronkite. As we lunched, Cronkite told me about the TBS special and indicated that he might want to interview me. He wanted a younger person's perspective on the phenomenon. Most of the UFO researchers in those days were older and had taken up the topic as a retirement project. Cronkite was especially interested in some of the Air Force stories I'd collected about the cover-up. After about 30 minutes of back-and-forth conversation, Cronkite said to me, "Let me tell you my UFO story." For the next 5 minutes, I sat in stunned silence as he told me what had happened. In the 1950s, Cronkite was part of a pool of news reporters brought out to a small South Pacific island to watch the test of a new Air Force missile. The reporters had been warned that photography and audio recordings were forbidden. They would have to give a written account of the event. As Air Force security personnel walked around the perimeter of the test area with guard dogs and the news reporters watched, the missile fired up and was about to be released. Just then, a large disc-type UFO appeared on the scene. Cronkite guessed that the object was about 50 to 60 feet in diameter, a dull gray color, and had no visible means of propulsion. Because the noise of activity around him and the missile engine was so loud, he couldn't tell whether the disc made any noise. He didn't notice any coming directly from the object. As Air Force guards ran toward the UFO with their dogs, the disc hovered about 30 feet off of the ground. It suddenly sent out a blue beam of light which struck the missile. It also struck a guard and a dog at the same time. The missile was frozen in midair about 70 feet from the launcher as it had taken off, and the guard was frozen in mid-step and a dog frozen in midair as he jumped at the disc. Cronkite reminded me that all this happened within a very short space of time, probably about 5 minutes or less. Suddenly, the missile exploded. After that, the disc vanished. The guard and dog looked all right, but were quickly taken away by medical personnel. At the same time, guards rapidly ushered the reporters into a concrete observation bunker. After about 30 minutes of sitting in that hot box, they were brought out into the air again and addressed by an Air Force colonel. The officer told them it was all part of the test. Obviously making it up as he went along, the colonel said the event was staged to test media reaction to UFOs. He reinforced the usual line to the reporters that flying saucers were probably not extraterrestrial, but what people were actually seeing was secret planes being tested by the Air Force. This test was designed to show the media how shocking it could be to suddenly view a new technology. Well, Cronkite was certain that what he viewed was indeed a new technology, but he was also sure it was not an earthly one. He didn't believe the Air Force explanation then, and he didn't believe it at the time that he told me the story. During the 1960s, a UFO supposedly crashed along the U.S.-Mexican border. It may have been one of several crashes in that region. USA forces were said to have crossed the border to retrieve any intact parts of the UFO or occupants that had survived the crash. This photograph is said to be proof that one did. The photo was sent to Project Blue Book for comment. After a brief period of study, the Air Force said it was a real photo, but that the creature in it was an ape used in rocketry research. It's interesting to note that the Air Force explanation coincided with a popular movie at that time called The Planet of the Apes. Perhaps they took a cue from Hollywood. Whether you believe the ape explanation or not, stories of UFO crash retrievals by the U.S. government go back as far as modern sightings themselves. During World War II, it's thought that a UFO crashed into a frozen lake on the small Arctic island of Spitsbergen. This may have happened once or even twice before. Because Spitsbergen was under Swedish control and Sweden was a neutral country during the war, the incident wasn't acted on by any of the world's major powers at that time. But in 1946, the U.S. government made arrangements to investigate and, if necessary, obtain the object. Already on a goodwill tour sponsored by the Shell Oil Company to help promote the rebuilding of Europe, General James Doolittle was said to have been asked by U.S. authorities to investigate the matter. Doolittle was famous for leading the daring bomber raid on Tokyo at the very start of World War II. After spending what seemed like an unusual amount of time on Spitsbergen, Doolittle is said to have arranged for the crashed object and possibly its deceased occupants to be brought back to America on the USS Alabama. A few sailors who recall the Alabama's trip to Spitsbergen have said that the object was loaded onto the ship in a large crate. The crate was secured on deck and covered with canvas. The ship then immediately returned to the United States with its strange cargo. During the voyage, no one but an elite guard unit was allowed near the crate. Harrier Jets have become an important part of the United States military. Originally developed over 40 years ago, beginning with the Hawker series of aircraft, which incorporated a French engine design into a British plane, today's Harrier is the result of international cooperation and is one of the Western world's most lethal weapons. With a track record of reliability, this workhorse aircraft rarely gets into trouble. But like all aircraft, they can be vulnerable to the whims of unknown intelligences piloting vehicles far more advanced. On October 22, 1989, experienced British aerospace pilot Taylor Scott took off from Dunsville, England. 7 minutes into the flight, he told air traffic controllers that he was approaching his 30,000-foot ceiling. After that, silence. Concerned that something had happened, British authorities asked a nearby U.S. Air Force Galaxy transport aircraft to go over and take a look. What they saw, none of them will ever forget. Crew members aboard the Galaxy transport saw the Harrier flying by itself without a pilot on board. This is a still from a video taken by one of the Galaxy crew members using his own personal video camera. They reported that the canopy and ejection seat were gone from the aircraft and that it was flying on automatic settings. The Galaxy stayed with the jet until it stalled and crashed into the sea. But a British investigation revealed conflicting details. While they originally believed that an ejection seat rocket had misfired and flung the pilot helplessly from his aircraft, a later examination of the wreck showed that probably wasn't the case. One investigator said it was as though the pilot had simply been snatched from his plane. The final report of the investigation was never made available to the public. On April 18, 1996, Governor Miller of Nevada officially dedicated State Route 375 as the Extraterrestrial Highway. The ceremony was held in Rachel, Nevada. The highway stretches approximately 100 miles through Lincoln and Nye counties, 140 miles north of Las Vegas, and connects highways 93 and 6. It's some distance from, but has become synonymous with, the U.S. government reservation known as Area 51. What we call Area 51 is actually a huge block of land owned and used by the U.S. government. Every branch of the military is represented there, and the property serves a variety of functions. While the government now admits that the place exists, they have no comments regarding its use. The area most associated with the UFO phenomenon is the Nellis Air Force Range, where secret planes have been tested for years. But in the early 1990s, a whistleblower told the world that something else was being tested there too. Robert Lazar is a physicist. He's claimed to have worked for the Department of Naval Intelligence at a facility within Area 51 known as S4. In an effort to prove his story to the world, Lazar has produced an ID and W-2 which show he worked for the Navy. The MAJ designation on his badge is said to go along with the idea that a group called MJ, or Majestic 12, always headed by a naval officer, dictates policy and controls information related to UFOs and extraterrestrials for the U.S. government. The purpose of the S4 facility was said to reverse engineer captured alien hardware, but test flights of still very flight-worthy discs were also said to have taken place there. The crafts operated using a gravity drive and were capable of amazing maneuvers without causing harm to the pilots inside. As part of the briefing for his employment at S4, Lazar was shown what he described as a short history of what the government has been able to learn about the creatures that build and fly these discs. Everything from samples of their writings to a physical description and photos of the creatures themselves were included. It's said that recordings have been found that show scenes from our early history, leaving the impression that these beings have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. More on Robert Lazar and S4 is available on my video, Secrets of Area 51 and Roswell. Astronomers peering through their telescopes often saw strange objects coming and going from the moon, as this 1880s photograph illustrates. Astronaut John Glenn saw and photographed strange objects in space during his historic 1962 Mercury spaceflight. As soon as humans arrived in space, they found that they were not alone. During the moon flights, astronauts found it hard to mask descriptions of what they saw when it came to UFOs. Some made statements using old pilot slang for UFOs, referring to them as things like Santa Claus. Wally Schirra was the first to use the Santa term to describe a UFO during a Mercury 8 flight. Astronauts often reported seeing strange lights on the dark side of the moon. During a 1968 moon mission, astronaut James Lovell said, "Please be informed that there is a Santa Claus," after seeing something odd on the dark side. Neil Armstrong, the first man to set foot on the moon, was photographed with a large bright object hovering over his head. In 1992, a French astronomer saw and photographed odd lights inside the huge moon crater Langrenus. Such lights have been seen by astronomers for over 100 years and remain unexplained. Scientists refer to them as transient lunar phenomena. Is this strange object filmed from an Apollo spacecraft near the moon a possible source for the odd lights? More than a few moonwalkers reported a feeling that they were always being watched. The truth may be out there, but if it's on the moon, NASA probably airbrushed it out. The upside of modern technology is the ability for us to go back and look at what amounts to some creative artwork on moon photos that have been touched up by NASA. Here we see an Apollo astronaut standing in front of a totally black background. Where are the stars? When a computer reads through the changes made to the photo, we see what appears to be the ruins of a dome. In 1967, the unmanned Surveyor 6 took this photo of what appears to be a dome covering the Sinus Medi area of the moon. These domes illustrate that someone visited and possibly occupied the moon long before we ever walked on it. NASA may have covered up this information to avoid allowing other nations the opportunity to gain access to whatever discoveries they made. The Space Shuttle program has also had its share of odd happenings involving UFOs. On March 24, 1989, veteran Space Shuttle astronaut John Blaha paused during a conversation, then told Houston that we still have the alien spacecraft under observation. That mission landed at night and under a veil of secrecy. Blaha has not commented on the event. No photo taken by NASA has evoked more controversy than this one. It shows what seems to be a perfectly formed face on the planet Mars, with several pyramids nearby in a neat circle. The so-called face on Mars opened the door to expose many lies that NASA has told about the red planet. NASA told the public that Mars was a dead, waterless world with an atmosphere too thin to support life. A thin atmosphere? They sent probes that used parachutes, allowing the machines to float to the ground. No water? NASA has done a complete reversal on this and now believes there to be a substantial amount of frozen water under the surface. A dead world? Several probes sent to Mars have mysteriously malfunctioned, and as with the moon, strange lights are often seen on the surface. Is this Manhattan on Mars? This photo appears to show the remains of a large city that once sat on an island surrounded by water. Like many other parts of Mars, this area shows artificial manipulation of the landscape that geologists cannot easily explain. The study of UFOs can sometimes be a very dangerous business. Former naval officer Bill Cooper delivered an expose about the government cover-up of UFOs in 1989 entitled The Secret Government. For the next 10 years, Cooper spoke out against government secrecy. In March of 1999, Bill Cooper sent his family out of the United States for their security. He lived and worked alone with his 2 dogs, 1 rooster, and 1 chicken. Having run afoul of the government, he found himself charged with various crimes. When police came to serve warrants on him, they claimed that he ran from them, jumped in his car, drove around patrol vehicles, went in his home and started firing shots at them. A pretty athletic feat for a guy with just one leg. They shot and killed him. For several years, Bill Schneider spoke to anyone who would listen about his involvement with the construction of secret underground bases allegedly used by the United States government to deal with aliens. Schneider accused the government of selling out to alien influences. One of the places where the government is said to have built underground facilities is near Dulce, New Mexico. These underground bases are allegedly shared between humans and aliens and seem to serve their interest more than ours. Some believe the government allows the aliens to abduct people for the purposes of experimentation and study in return for technology. But at this time, these theories are mere speculation. It's interesting to note that a number of unexplained cattle mutilations have occurred in the Dulce area. Such mutilations take place worldwide and are often associated with UFO sightings. During his travels, Bill Schneider was shot on numerous occasions. In 1996, he was found dead in his home, having been tortured and killed. Tubing was wrapped around his neck. Despite this, his death was ruled a suicide. Bill's father worked as a ship's doctor on the USS Eldridge, famous for being involved with the Philadelphia experiment. There are many different interpretations and views of what really happened or didn't when the U.S. Navy embarked on a project to demagnetize warships beginning in 1943. The information that I'm about to provide represents my best guess based on 30 years of research into an experiment that began 60 years ago, and my own encounters with those who claim intimate knowledge about the project. I grew up in the 1960s and first became aware of the Philadelphia experiment when I was just 10 years old. I read a number of non-fiction books about UFOs. The two subjects became linked when Morris K. Jessup wrote a book entitled The Case for the U.F.O. in 1955. After the book was published, a mysterious man who called himself Carlos Miguel Allende wrote to Jessup in the first of a series of rambling correspondences. The letters seemed to indicate that Jessup's call for open discussion and government disclosure of any knowledge about UFOs was a waste of time. According to Allende, there were other forces at work which sought to protect various secrets regarding how UFOs were powered and did the things they did. Although Jessup was not impressed with Allende's letters, he was more than a little surprised after being contacted by 3 naval officers who worked for the Office of Naval Research, the ONR. Although they claimed the contact was not official and made on their own initiative, the officers seemed disturbed by an annotated copy of Jessup's book that the ONR had received. The book had notes scribbled in it by what appeared to be 3 different people, but most now agree it was all the work of Allende. Again, the references seem to indicate that the government had accidentally discovered how UFOs are able to manipulate time and space through a Navy project designed to make ships invisible. After contact with the Navy, Jessup was certain that he had stumbled onto something and thrust all his efforts into finding out what it was. By 1959, Jessup had assembled an impressive portfolio of research into what the U.S. military knew and was hiding from the public about UFOs and the secret Navy experiment. Set to testify about these matters before a Florida senator and several interested parties, Jessup set off to drive from his home in Florida to Washington, D.C. in 1959, but he never made it. Morris K. Jessup was found dead in his car just off of a highway in Dade County, Florida. He had died from exposure to carbon monoxide. Although his death was ruled a suicide, none of his papers or the extensive research he had recently completed was ever located. I read about some of this in a book published in the 1960s by Jessup's friend and colleague, Ivan T. Sanderson. Sanderson wasn't just another author. He was a scientist who believed in the possibility of alien visitations to Earth based on the available evidence. Shortly before Morris Jessup's death, Jessup gave Sanderson a copy of The Case for the U.F.O., which contained his notes about annotations made by Allende. My own interest in the Navy project might have been satisfied at that point, but for a chance meeting with a former sailor who had been at the Philadelphia Navy shipyard during World War II. In 1973, I visited the family of my best friend's bride-to-be in Florida. We all got together to discuss and further plan for the upcoming wedding. Amy's father was a retired sailor named Joseph. He was a polite but serious individual. During a lighter moment in conversation, I happened to mention the Navy project that I read about and its supposed connection to flying saucers. There had been a number of UFO sightings in Florida during that time, and the topic was on everyone's lips. After dinner, Amy's father sat down across from me while the others muddled through some wedding plans and became very serious. He told me that in 1944 he'd met another sailor who seemed deeply disturbed about the outcome of a strange experiment connected to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in 1943. The man claimed that his best friend died during the experiment. Joseph and his new acquaintance shared many conversations about it after becoming friends. The man said that after making some casual inquiries, a doctor at the shipyard hospital confided to him that his friend had died as a result of melting into the ship's superstructure. The physician claimed that the man was still alive when they tried to free him from part of the deck, but he had been fused with it. I encouraged Joseph to write down everything he could remember about his conversations with the sailor. He agreed and actually took things a step further. He attempted to contact the man who he had befriended so many years before, but hadn't heard from in some time. A mutual friend told him that the sailor had passed away, but provided a contact phone number for his widow. When Joseph called, the woman accepted his condolences, and the two had a brief conversation. It seems that after the sailor retired in the 1960s, he tried contacting others who had been a part of the Navy project to get more information on the death of his friend. But the sailor died a few months later in a hit-and-run accident. This made Joseph think twice about his own investigation of the matter, which ended abruptly after that call. From then on, I began to seriously research the Philadelphia experiment. By the 1980s, a book on the subject had been published by William Moore and Charles Berlitz entitled The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility. The book was the short version of some truth, various theories, and some wild notions by Berlitz. Moore was forced to endure some of the nonsense included in the book by Berlitz in order to get it published. While Moore was new to the publishing world, Charles Berlitz had already written a successful, if not equally vague, book on the Bermuda Triangle. While the Moore and Berlitz book brought attention to the subject and satisfied those already mildly interested in the subject matter, most of the attention came in the form of scorn and skeptical criticism. Critics pointed to what they felt were a number of glaring errors and historical inaccuracies. Things got worse when a major Hollywood film based on the book was released in 1984. Instead of becoming a documentary-style piece, it was a fictionalized account of the Navy project that turned out to be a sci-fi love story mixed with ridiculous twists and turns. I doubt that anyone, except those with direct involvement, know the truth and entire story of the Philadelphia experiment. But here is my take on what happened. Several young scientists at Princeton University in New Jersey had been working on various physics projects involving time travel, time displacement, and using strong energy fields to move and manipulate objects from a purely theoretical standpoint. This was all done on paper, and nothing could be proved. As World War II began, most knew that the U.S. was secretly trying to develop an atomic weapon that would end the war quickly. Many of the scientists, like Einstein, knew that this was something that was necessary because they felt the Germans might have been doing it also. But they also knew that a weapon like this was not something that could be put back in the box after the war was won. The Navy had their own doubts about the atomic weapon. They were certain that nothing short of a full-scale naval assault on the home islands of Japan would end the war. In the meantime, they faced another problem. The Navy was losing ships to German U-boat attacks and a new type of mine that the Nazis were using, which could attach itself to the hulls of ships by being attracted to them because of their magnetized hulls. They needed to find a way to quickly demagnetize their ships and make them invisible to U-boats and other attack ships and planes. The Navy traditionally degaussed ships in port, but this was a time-consuming method of demagnetizing that was impractical during wartime. They also tried using various exotic paint mixtures designed to refract or redirect light away from their ships, but this still left them visible and vulnerable to Air Force's radar and submarine attack. When the Navy came calling at Princeton, a few young physicists saw an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. They would solve the Navy's little problem, and at the same time test some of their own theories regarding time displacement and using strong energy fields to manipulate matter in a real-world setting. Although his work during World War II remains classified to this day, Albert Einstein was under contract to the Navy during that time. What I've been able to glean from many sources is that Einstein, even though he had once asked Franklin Roosevelt to begin development of an atomic bomb, still preferred the development of defensive weapons, knowing that the atom bomb was something that could ultimately lead to the complete destruction of the human race. Those who agreed with the defensive weapons idea at Princeton were invited to join his efforts. This group of scientists told the Navy that they could make a ship invisible to radar, sonar, and would work on ways to effectively hide it from view. Of course, what they didn't explain was the actual nature of the technology they were planning on using to accomplish these goals. Because it was so close to Princeton, secure, and had ships available for experimentation, the Philadelphia Navy shipyard was chosen as the physical home of the project. The new and not yet commissioned ship which would eventually be called the USS Eldridge, was chosen as a test craft for the project. Jane's Military, noted for its accuracy, lists the Eldridge as having been launched in June of 1943. The official Navy records list it as having been launched in July of 1943. This easily leaves the window open for the ship to have been used for the initial experiments. The first part of the experimentation took place at the shipyard in 1943 when a powerful energy field was used to instantly degauss the ship without any damage to electronic equipment on board. The vessel also became invisible to radar, but an unexpected and more than welcomed side effect occurred that scientists had hoped for, but the Navy didn't expect. The ship briefly vanished from sight, becoming what the observers had thought was invisible. In reality, the ship had briefly moved to another time and place, having returned when the off-ship field generating equipment was shut down. Some small animals placed on board in cages died after a strange greenish glow encircled the hull just before and after the ship vanished. No humans were on board during that particular test that we know about, and the details of the animal deaths were ignored by naval officials overseeing the project after being told that the fields in use could be adjusted for safety. The experiment moved forward full speed. By 1944, a sea trial was ordered. The Eldridge was manned and surrounded by several other ships. All carried the same technology, with the hope that convoys of radar and sonar invisible ships would pass German U-boats and other enemy craft undetected. But the Eldridge was the only vessel given permission to power up to full field strength on that particular occasion. With many observers, including a merchant marine later known as Carlos Miguel Allende aboard the USS Furiasat, the experiment commenced off the east coast of the United States, somewhere between Long Island and New Jersey. While everyone watched, the Eldridge powered up its field generation equipment. As before, a strange green glow appeared and the ship began to fade from sight. On board, things started to go badly. Sailors became disoriented, couldn't see, and some were burnt by the green mist. Others faded into the wooden deck and steel superstructure of the ship. Moments after it vanished in 1944, the Eldridge briefly appeared in 1983 off of the coast of Long Island. That occurred because the ship had been pulled through a sort of time displacement wormhole simultaneously created by the 1944 experiment and another one taking place as a follow-up project at a government base thought to be abandoned near Montauk Point in 1983. When the Montauk base shut down their power in '83, the ship was pulled back through the vortex to 1944 and reappeared seconds after. Upon its return, strange objects were seen above the ship. These may have been UFOs. It's possible and even likely that humans had just discovered how aliens were able to warp and manipulate time and space fields to move about as they liked. But in 1944, humans lacked the technology or computers to control such powerful energy fields. The result was that a third of the crew died, having become a part of the ship's wooden deck and steel superstructure. Many parts of the ship were covered with canvas to conceal the dead, before it was allowed to return to the Philadelphia Navy shipyard that night. Those who survived the 1944 sea trial sometimes faded back and forth between time periods. An article in a 1944 edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper stated that during a bar fight at a local dive where sailors and workers from the Navy Yard drank, 2 sailors briefly became translucent and even transparent, fading into the rear wall of the bar. Others went insane. By 1945, the Navy had all the remaining sailors from the second part of the Philadelphia experiment sea trials locked up in the shipyard hospital's mental ward. What became of them after that, I don't know. While naysayers point out that members of the commissioned Eldridge's crew say none of this ever happened on their watch, most of what happened did so before the ship was commissioned, or possibly during times when a special crew was placed on board for the project. Besides that, the Eldridge was a cookie-cutter ship. There were thousands of ships like it made, and it's likely that one of them could have also been used as part of the experiment. Since we don't have... Although disappointed at some of the results of the sea trials, the Navy realized that it had a new and exciting technology, and they weren't about to let it go. Not only had the project shown them that the use of controlled energy fields could produce the ability to move objects and people rapidly through time and space, but the fields produced an effect on the human mind. After some of the sailors from the 1944 sea trials went insane, the Navy wondered if that effect could be controlled and directed at friendly forces to make them fight fearlessly, or at enemy forces to make them surrender. All these theories would later be tested at what had once been the home of World War II shore batteries, and later a radar facility used to protect coastal areas of North America from incoming bombers or missiles during part of the Cold War. Willing and unwilling participants were apparently brought to the government facility once known as Camp Hero near Montauk Point to test the new technology. Because these tests attracted UFOs, it was no accident that thousands of sightings occurred during the time period when the tests were accomplished. This led some UFO researchers to erroneously conclude that Long Island hosted some sort of base for UFOs, possibly somewhere offshore. Rudder, a popular boating magazine in the 1960s, ran a 1969 article warning boaters that a number of pleasure craft had encountered UFOs off of the Long Island coast near Montauk Point and were unable to restart their engines after these objects moved. Regarding Einstein's possible involvement, he was never actually seen at the shipyard that we know about, but it's possible that his position with the project was more a ceremonial one, allowing the Navy to make use of whatever ideas he cared to input, while other physicists and engineers were given carte blanche on the scene to do whatever was necessary to get the job done. Most of them were young, ambitious, and eager to test their theories in the real world. Today, we may be seeing some of the fruits of the Philadelphia experiment in the form of a growing fleet of advanced ships with stealth capabilities, classified weapon systems, and secret technology. Even a stealth sub is in the works. But was the technology applicable to more than just seagoing vessels? By the time 1966 rolled around, a series of top-secret experiments had been underway for at least 10 years on creating a fleet of truly invisible military aircraft. Faced with the daily embarrassment of advanced aircraft being shot down in Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara, made a desperate decision. He decided to test a new technology to make large military aircraft invisible. Imagine the advantage of having large military bombers and transport aircraft available to you that were completely invisible. The test would be carried out at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida and would involve a hand-picked crew that had trained for the mission for nearly a year. On a warm summer day in 1966, a C-130 lifted off from the runway at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, preparing to test the nation's newest and most controversial technology. After a few minutes in the air, the crew activated the equipment. This was the first real test of the technology in the aircraft with a crew on board. People on the ground reported seeing the aircraft begin to fade, but also said that strange objects, which looked like UFOs, appeared around it. As with the Philadelphia experiment, the use of technology designed to use the same energy fields that UFOs might use to move about in time and space may have attracted them to the... Seconds after the plane vanished over Florida, it reappeared over Hampton Bays, Virginia. Not knowing what happened, the crew asked for permission to land at the nearby Naval Air Station in Norfolk. Shocked when they were refused, the confused crew decided to land anyway. Once on the ground, they were surrounded by Marines and Shore Patrol personnel. As they attempted to open the huge back door of the aircraft, the crew members were attacked. One of them was shot and killed and fell out of the aircraft. The others closed the plane up and attempted to take off while still being attacked. They had no way of knowing that their little experiment had moved them through time and space from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida in 1966 to Hampton Bays, Virginia in 1982. Because they were using the wrong frequencies and flying an aircraft unknown to the military in 1982, the base took action against what could have been, for all they knew, terrorists trying to land in the midst of an important government area. Once aloft, they turned on the invisibility technology again, hoping to avoid being shot down. Seconds after turning on the special technology, the C-130 vanished over the naval facility and reappeared over Eglin Air Force Base back in 1966. At that point, it collided with a UFO still in the area and began a fast descent to the ground. Just before crashing, one crew member jumped to safety. His name was Robert Marsh Jr., and that's how I found out about this story. Because he had all the names of those involved, it was easy to verify. The most interesting thing that came out of the entire incident was how a crew member aboard a flight taking off in 1966 from Eglin Air Force Base in Florida can die on that flight, but have a death certificate from 1982 Virginia. Nikola Tesla was an alternative energy genius. Among his inventions were radio-controlled weapons and AC power generators. It was his understanding of powerful energy fields that made him essential to the Philadelphia experiment. Tesla made an announcement in the early part of the 20th century that he had actually made contact with aliens, but few took it seriously. Maybe they should have. Nikola Tesla had a plan to transmit electricity through the air like radio waves. In test after test, his system worked. The power could even be used by totally electric-powered aircraft. But not everyone was happy with the idea. He built a test tower designed to transmit electricity on the north shore of the eastern end of Long Island. At the same time, he had tunnels built throughout the area for support of his energy system. But after Thomas Edison used his influence to convince authorities that Tesla's system was a danger to the public, federal authorities seized and destroyed his equipment. Most believe that those who heavily invested in electric power as an income source were concerned about Tesla's idea to make it available to everyone for free. Despite their falling out, Tesla and the government were said to have worked together on a number of projects, including the Philadelphia experiment. In 1989, I was able to film and question 3 witnesses who also claimed to have been involved with the original Philadelphia experiment and a follow-up project which apparently took place during the 1970s and 80s. The interview and a presentation by them took place at a private home on Long Island and included just a few specially invited guests. Although some of their claims seemed almost insane, I was intrigued. Knowing what the topic would be beforehand, I brought with me a technical writer who had a good understanding of electronics, energy fields, and electrical engineering. I wanted his professional opinion regarding the technical aspects of their information. To make a long story short, he did not sleep for several days after the event, having been completely stunned by what he had heard. I too was shocked by the information that I received from Al Bielek, Preston Nichols, and Duncan Cameron. But being a paranormal researcher with years of experience, I've learned to always look at the bigger picture, not individual stories or pieces of evidence which are always subject to personal interpretation. In this case, it was obvious these men had been through something. They had far too much knowledge and impressively cohesive stories to be faking it, although I did not necessarily agree with all their conclusions. While Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron had been sailors aboard the Eldridge, Preston Nichols had worked at the Montauk base. All 3 ended up working there on experiments involving time travel and mind control on captured UFO technology and what was developed through the original Philadelphia experiment. It came as no surprise that after I introduced some of the survivors of the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project to the world through my video set, The Truth About the Philadelphia Experiment, authorities in charge of the Montauk base clamped down hard on uninvited visitors. The clamp got even tighter as I added the subject of what had allegedly happened there to my seminar. That seminar brought the story of the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project to tens of thousands of people throughout North America via my live seminars and to thousands more on video. The clampdown on already restricted public access to the property was justified by local authorities who claimed that visiting the old base was dangerous. They expressed concern that people might be injured trying to gain access to abandoned buildings or lost in unmapped underground areas. So why leave what they claim is an abandoned base intact in the first place? Why not just go in with bulldozers, explosives, and clear the entire area? Since New York State claims they now own most of the property, why not just clear it and sell the much-desired beachfront land for $1 zillion a square foot to solve all the state budget problems? To put the value of the property into perspective, the sale of all that beachfront land could probably pay for most of the Homeland Security budget for the entire eastern part of the United States for the next 10 years. But it remains unsold, just as the buildings and underground areas remain intact. Why? Camp Hero is the actual designation of what we call the Montauk base that lies at the far eastern end of Long Island on the South Shore. Although it's just south of the historic Montauk Lighthouse, most people have no idea that this facility even exists. Records are sketchy and mostly unavailable on the property, but it's been owned by or under U.S. government influence for almost 200 years. Once considered strategically important, the base was supposedly closed and abandoned in 1966. It's used as an observation area, port, shore battery installation, and radar facility. The continued use of the property by the federal government was considered unnecessary after another facility took over radar monitoring responsibilities needed for NORAD. At that point, it was turned over to New York State, which has since described it as undeveloped park land. Despite denials from the U.S. government that the base is still a federal facility, it still takes an intervention from a New York State representative or senator to legally visit the property. Once a request has been made by the office of a federal lawmaker on the behalf of a citizen wanting to visit the property, it must be cleared by higher authorities. Who those higher authorities are is unclear. The reason given for this is a small patch of antennas on a tiny hill that is easily visible near the old main entrance to the base. These antennas are used as part of the U.S. Coast Guard communication system and have been for years. Despite the fact that they could have easily been moved elsewhere to a higher and better location at any time, allowing the antennas to remain there gives the federal government a measure of control over the property. That's the enigma of the secrecy that surrounds Montauk. Nothing makes sense about the place and hasn't since the 1960s. I have visited the base on several occasions, spending a considerable amount of time there, and this is no easy task. Men dressed as fishermen regularly walk the perimeter to be sure that no one strolling along the beach or near the lighthouse wanders onto the property. Although they never seem to have any fishing gear or poles, these tall and tough fishermen warn off potential visitors to the base by reminding them that the property is closed to the general public. Each time I visited the base, it was on a major holiday. I knew that there would be few, if any, actual security people on the periphery of the facility. Once inside, I would just have to be extremely careful. On a related note, a four-wheel drive vehicle frantically drove around the base roads after I noticed a surveillance camera staring me in the face at one of the buildings during my first visit. Fortunately, I evaded capture. I visited the Montauk base seeking to verify two incredible stories. According to witnesses interviewed on my Philadelphia experiment video, which also covers the Montauk project thoroughly, the base was used as a continuation for government experiments involving time travel and mind control technology, first discovered during the initial endeavor in the 1940s. The huge radar tower was said to be the instrument that directed waves of mind-altering signals out for miles and into towns that surround the base. Despite the fact that the radar dish wasn't supposed to have been used since the 1960s, I found it in remarkably good condition. The electricity in the tall radar building was on, and the restroom was usable. Although the large motors that moved the dish had been disconnected from it and removed, the dish was allowed to sway in the wind to keep it from collapsing. The technology being used for the alleged mind control signal may have been omnidirectional, not requiring the specific movement of the huge dish to a certain bearing. Large numbers of modern-looking wires ran from tubes coming up from the underground into the building and vanished inside its walls. When turned on during the 1980s, the signal would create havoc in surrounding towns. Some of these peaceful places hadn't had any murders or even their own police forces since the Revolutionary War. Although some of the old base houses lie in ruin, many of the offices looked as though they had been recently used. A few actually had working phones. Although many of the buildings looked to be in a sad state of maintenance from the outside, many were in nearly perfect condition inside. Some had lights on and seemed to have been altered for other uses. The inside of the chapel, for example, contained a modern gymnasium. The old PX, seen here, seemed to have become some sort of a kitchen, with hundreds of metal food trays neatly stacked on racks. Other buildings had new fences erected around them, and very modern security cameras almost hidden from view were placed in trees, on rooftops, and along walkways. I went during a chilly time of year, and heat freely flowed through an external system that ran to every building. But the biggest surprise of all waited for me in the underground area. Despite the fact that the base was never occupied by more than 60 or 70 people during any of its incarnations, a trip into the underground area revealed hundreds of wooden racks or bunk beds inside a large maze of what seemed like fenced-in and locked areas. It looked almost like a huge base brig or prison, but why so many sleeping areas? The answer might just lie in what the Montauk survivors have claimed. They say that hundreds of people were brought there, against their will, to be part of whatever went on underground. The proof of this seems to be found in the hundreds of sleeping areas and converted PX building where meals for that many people could easily be prepared and delivered to the underground as needed. Another story involving the base was that a large beast, seen on this security camera still, had appeared as a result of underground experiments, gotten loose, and caused external damage above ground. After that, some of the experiments were shut down and the infamous time travel chair removed. I did find some buildings which looked as though they had been attacked and partially destroyed by something big and powerful. Huge holes made it look as if something had punched its way out of the underground tunnels. The remaining tunnels and underground areas were sealed and cemented off where the chair may have been. What took place in the underground area was shocking. One story told to me by Al, Preston, and Duncan was that after Al was placed in the time travel chair, he found himself in the middle of terrible destruction at some future point in New York City. Since much had been done to these people to try and erase what memories they had of the entire project, I wasn't sure if they actually knew when this event would occur. Based on what they said back in 1989, I now believe Al had been transported in time to the year 2001 and the World Trade Center disaster site. The description he gave to me at that time, and that was captured on video, is eerily similar to what Ground Zero looked like after the Trade Center buildings fell. My feelings about this were further confirmed by the fact that he had said he saw the statue of a horse in the midst of the rubble, which didn't make any sense. But then I remembered something. One thing that survived the horrific collapse of the Trade Center buildings was a large sculpture. If a person seeing it was in enough of a disturbed state, it might just look like what Al described. especially given the brainwashing he endured by the government to make him forget the entire incident. It's interesting to note that in 1989, when I asked all three participants in the interview about the incident involving Isle and the rubble in New York City, all absolutely refused to comment on it. I felt as though I was walking through a ghost town where the residents had simply vanished or moved underground, but could return at any time to use buildings ready for them. The Montauk survivors believed that the project, in one form or another, was still going on there. While walking on certain parts of the base, I felt a steady thumping under my feet. Given the fact that I had sneakers on and saw no evidence of above-ground construction or a source for the strange vibration, this was more than a little disconcerting. Stooping down to feel the ground with my hands, the thumping was more pronounced. I believe they might have been building new or repairing old underground areas. I visited the Montauk base with neutral thoughts, neither believing nor disbelieving the incredible claims made about the facility by those who say they survived horrifying ordeals there. My concern was finding evidence to support or refute the claims being made. What I found was a base that seemed abandoned, but also very active. The physical condition of what I examined more than supported at least the background fabric of the stories I was told. If you go to the base today, all the old accesses to the underground areas have been tightly sealed. But there is still access to caves along the beach area, once used by bootleggers during Prohibition to smuggle in illegal booze from offshore boats. Many of these caves connect to tunnels built by Nikola Tesla for experiments with electricity many years ago. These tunnels are separate and apart from the others used for access to the shore batteries and the old fort. It would be easy to use these resources to construct a new and even larger underground area for continued experimentation. Why there? Maybe it's some sort of a vortex. I don't know and can't say. But I do know and now believe that at least part of the truth about what the U.S. government knows or has developed as a result of the Philadelphia experiment and captured alien technology is likely buried under what is still described as undeveloped New York State parkland. Is there really any proof that people have traveled through time? At one point, time travel was thought to be impossible, a mere sci-fi fantasy for idle dreamers to speculate on. But the same may be said of the concepts of manned flight, voyages under the sea, and trips to the moon, which were all once considered the stuff of science fiction novels. The best proof of time travel may be the future knowledge known to a person or people who would not have been able to otherwise obtain it. Jules Verne was one of these people. He predicted deep sea exploration and trips to the moon. In fact, in his book From the Earth to the Moon, Verne predicted that 3 astronauts would take off in a multi-stage rocket to travel to the moon. H.G. Wells wrote about a time machine in a day when it would have been hard to imagine such a thing. But he also predicted and described the invention of multi-line phones, the computer, fax machines, and portable communication devices. His description of a military tank long before the first one was ever invented and used in World War I left military experts stunned. No less astonishing is this Egyptian carving from the Temple of Abydos. While some Egyptologists feel it is merely a coincidence or recarving of a previously carved hieroglyph, It seems to indicate the presence of a helicopter, jet, spacecraft, and other futuristic machines. And what would be the odds of all these things being on just one panel together if it was a mistake or recarving? Leonardo da Vinci was a man far ahead of his time. Painter, sculptor, inventor, and scholar. Da Vinci came up with ideas that seems out of sync with the day in which he lived. In a day when manned flight was still a very distant dream, he came up with the idea for a parachute. When travel by sea was still a risky and dangerous venture, Da Vinci invented a diving suit, complete with hoses and a special machine for providing fresh air. While fixed-wing flight was still centuries away, Leonardo already had the idea for a helicopter. Even today, many of Da Vinci's ideas for flying machines boggle the minds of scientists and engineers alike. Perhaps we have to wait a bit longer to understand all the things that he designed. Some may not have been invented yet. In the early 1960s, a painting was discovered in the Palatine Hill area of Rome. It's a place rich with ancient Roman ruins and has been a treasure trove for archaeologists. The painting, dated from ancient times, was a mystery. It seemed to show a very modern building and a rocket ship. Despite all attempts to explain it, the painting remains a mystery, but the scene in the painting is not. It shows a building that exists at the USA spaceport in Florida, along with a Mercury-style rocket and space capsule, complete with the emergency capsule escape jets mounted on top of the space capsule. The question is, how did the unknown artist know about it centuries before America even existed? In August of 2003, Al Bielek, one of the survivors of the Philadelphia experiment and time traveler at Montauk, predicted on a national radio program that there would be a power outage, a major grid outage, somewhere in the United States. It was just a few weeks later that a major power outage throughout the Northeast and parts of the Midwest occurred. Yet people still doubt that our government has been involved in time travel projects. It's hard to imagine the United States government giving up any secrets they know about space travel when they can't even admit to having been visited by extraterrestrial spacecraft. All attempts to get at the answers using the Freedom of Information Act are met by a wall of blacked out papers that are unlikely to hold any real clues to the truth anyway. The more sensitive the document, the more likely it ended up being placed in some officer or government operative's burn bag for ultimate destruction to keep state secrets out of the hands of enemies. We can only hope that if the 20th century will be remembered for being a time when government and military secrets were kept from the people, the 21st century will become best known for being a time during which at least some of the secrets were revealed.